Siegmund was dressing for the opera. He had been dressing for an hour. He had an abnormal and constant need for cleansing, to such an extent that he spent a considerable part of his time at the wash basin. He stood now in front of his large empire mirror with the white enameled frame, dipped a powder puff in its embossed box, and powdered his freshly shaven chin and cheeks. His beard was so strong that when he went out in the evening, he was obliged to shave a second time. He presented a colorful picture as he stood there, in rose-tinted silk drawers and socks, red Morocco slippers, and a quilted smoking jacket in a dark pattern with lappels of gray fur. For background, he had his large bedroom, full of all sorts of elegant and practical white enameled devices. Beyond the windows was a misty view over the treetops of the Tiergarten. It was growing dark. He turned on the circular arrangement of electric bulbs in the white ceiling. They filled the room with soft milky light. Then he drew the velvet curtains across the darkening panes. The light was reflected from the liquid depths of the mirrors and wardrobe, washstand, and dressing table. It flashed from the polished bottles on the tile-inlaid shelves. And Siegmund continued to work on himself. Now and then some thought in his mind would draw his brows together till they formed two black furrows over the bridge of the nose. His day had passed as his days usually did, vacantly and swiftly. The opera began at 6:30, and he had begun to change at 4:30, so there had not been much afternoon. He had rested on his chaise lounge from 2 to 3, then drunk tea and employed the remaining hour sprawled in a deep leather armchair in the study which he shared with Kunz, reading a few pages in each of several new novels. He had found them pitiably weak on the whole, but he had sent a few of them to the binders to be artistically bound in choice bindings for his library. He had, though, done some work in the morning. He had spent the hour from 10 to 11 in the atelier of his professor, an artist of European repute, who was developing Siegmund's talent for drawing and painting, and receiving from Herr Ehrenhold 2,000 marks a month for his services. But what Siegmund painted raised nothing more than an indulgent smile. He knew it himself. He was far from having any glowing expectations in his talent as an artist. He was too shrewd not to know that the conditions of his existence were not the most favorable in the world for the development of a creative gift. The accoutrements of life were so rich and varied, so elaborate, that almost no place at all was left for life itself. Each and every single accessory was so costly and beautiful that it had an existence above and beyond the purpose it was meant to serve, confusing the observer and absorbing attention. Siegmund had been born into superfluidity. He was perfectly adjusted to it. And yet it was a fact that this superfluidity never ceased to thrill and occupy him, to give him constant pleasure. Whether consciously or not, it was with him as with his father, who practiced the art of never getting used to anything. Siegmund loved to read. He strove after the word and the spirit as after a tool which a profound instinct urged him to grasp. But never had he lost himself in a book as one does when that single work seems the most important in the world, unique, a little, all-embracing universe into which one immerses and immures oneself in order to draw nourishment out of every syllable. The books and magazines streamed in. He could buy them all. They piled up around him, and even while he read, the number of those still to be read disturbed him. But he had the books bound in stamped leather and labeled with Siegmund Ehrenhold's beautiful bookplate. They stood in rows, weighing down his life like a possession which he did not succeed in subordinating to his personality. The day was his. It was given to him as a gift with all its hours from sunrise to sunset, and yet Siegmund found in his heart that he had no time for a resolve, much less for a deed. He was no hero. He commanded no enormous strength. The preparation, the lavish preliminaries for what should have been the serious business of life, used up all his energy. How much mental effort had to be expended simply in making a proper toilette? How much time and attention went to his supplies of cigarettes, soaps, and perfumes? How much occasion for making up his mind lay in that moment, recurring 2 or 3 times daily, when he had to select his cravat? And it was worth the effort. It was important. The blonde-haired citizenry of the land might go about in elastic-sided boots and turn-over collars, heedless of the effect, but he of all people, had to be unassailable and without reproach in his appearance from head to toe. And in the end, no one expected more of him. Sometimes there came moments when he had a feeble misgiving about the nature of the real. Sometimes he felt that this lack of expectation lamed and dislodged his sense of it. The household arrangements were all made to the end that the day might pass quickly and no empty hour be perceived. The next mealtime always came promptly. They dined before 7. The evening, when one can idle with a good conscience, was long. The days disappeared. Swiftly the seasons came and went. The family spent 2 summer months at their little castle on the lake, with its large and splendid grounds and many tennis courts, its cool paths through the parks, and shaven lawns adorned by bronze statuettes. A 3rd month was spent in the mountains, in hotels where life was even more luxurious than at home. Of late, during the winter, he had himself driven to the university to listen to a course of lectures on the history of art, which came at a convenient time. But he had to leave off because his sense of smell indicated that the rest of the class did not wash often enough. He spent the hour walking with Sieglinde instead. Always she had been at his side since the very first. She had clung to him since they lisped their first syllables, taken their first steps. He had no friends, never had one but this, his exquisitely groomed, darkly beautiful counterpart, whose moist and slender hand he held while the richly gilded, empty-eyed hours slipped past. They took fresh flowers with them on their walks, a bunch of violets or lilies of the valley, smelling them in turn or sometimes both together, with languid yet voluptuous abandon. They were like self-centered invalids who absorb themselves in trifles as narcotics to console them for the loss of hope. With an inward gesture of renunciation, they cast aside the evil-smelling world and loved each other alone, for the priceless sake of their own rare uselessness. But everything that they uttered was honed to a glittering sharpness, striking the people they met, the things they saw, everything done by somebody else, to the end that it might be exposed to the unerring eye, the sharp tongue, the witty condemnation. Then von Beckerath had appeared. He had a post in the government and came of a good family. He had proposed to Sieglinde. Frau Ehrenhold had supported him. Herr Ehrenhold had displayed a benevolent neutrality. Kunz the Hussar was his zealous partisan. He had been patient, assiduous, endlessly good-mannered and tactful, and in the end, after she had told him often enough that she did not love him, Sieglinde had begun to look at him searchingly, expectantly, mutely, with an earnestness in her glistening black eyes, which spoke without words, like an animal's, and had said yes. And Siegmund, whose will was her law, had taken up a position too. Slightly to his own disgust, he had not opposed the match. Was not Van Beckerath in the government and a man of good family too? Sometimes he wrinkled his brows over his toilette until they made 2 heavy black furrows at the bridge of his nose. He stood on the white bearskin which stretched out its claws beside the bed. His feet were lost in the long soft hair. He sprinkled himself lavishly with toilette water and took up his dress shirt. The starched and shining linen glided over his yellowish torso, which was as lean as a young boy's and yet shaggy with black hair. He arrayed himself further with black silk drawers, black silk socks, and heavy black silk suspenders with silver buckles, put on the well-pressed trousers of silky black cloth, fastened the white silk braces over his narrow shoulders, and with one foot on a stool began to button his shoes. There was a knock on the door. "May I come in, Gigi?" asked Sieglinde. "Yes, come in," he answered. She was already dressed, in a frock of shimmering sea-green silk, with a square neck outlined by a wide band of écru embroidery. 2 embroidered peacocks facing each other above the girdle held a garland in their beaks. Her dark brown hair was unadorned, but a large egg-shaped precious stone hung on a thin pearl chain against her bare skin, the color of smoked meerschaum. Over her arm she carried a scarf heavily worked with silver. "I am unable to conceal from you," she said, "that the carriage is waiting." He parried at once, "And I have no hesitation in replying that it will have to wait patiently 2 minutes more." It was at least 10. She sat down on the white velvet chaise lounge and watched him at his labors. Out of a rich chaos of ties, he selected a white piqué band and began to tie it before the glass. Beckerath, she said, wears colored cravats crossed over the way they wore them last year. Beckerath, he said, is the most banal being into whose existence it has been my misfortune to gain some insight. Turning to her quickly, he added, Moreover, you will do me the favor of not mentioning that Teuton's name to me again this evening. She gave a short laugh and replied, You may be sure it will not be a hardship. He put on the low-cut piqué waistcoat and drew his tailcoat over it, the soft silk lining caressing his hands as they passed through the sleeves. Let me see which buttons you have chosen, said Sieglinde. They were the amethyst ones, shirt studs, cufflinks, and waistcoat buttons, a complete set. She looked at him admiringly, proudly, adoringly, with a world of tenderness in her dark, shining eyes. He kissed the lips lying so softly on each other. They spent another minute on the chaise lounge in mutual caresses. Quite soft you are again, she said, stroking his shaven cheeks. Your little arms feel like satin, he said, running his hand down her tender forearm. He breathed in the violet odor of her hair. She kissed him on his closed eyelids. He kissed her on the throat where the pendant hung. They kissed one another's hands. They loved one another sweetly, sensually, for sheer mutual delight in their own well-groomed, pampered, expensive smell. They played together like puppies, biting each other with their lips. Then he got up. We mustn't be too late today, he said. He turned the top of the perfume bottle upside down on his handkerchief one last time, rubbed a drop into his narrow red hands, took his gloves, and declared himself ready to go. He put out the light and they went along the red-carpeted corridor hung with dark gold oil paintings and down the steps past the little organ. In the vestibule on the ground floor, Wendelin was waiting with their coats, gigantic in his long yellow ulster. They yielded their shoulders to his ministrations. Sieglinde's dark head was half lost in her collar of silver fox. Followed by the servant, they passed through the stone-paved vestibule into the outer air. It was mild, and there were great ragged flakes of snow in the pearly air. The coupé awaited them. The coachman bent down with his hand to his cockaded hat, while Wendelin ushered the brother and sister to their seats. Then the door banged shut, he swung himself up to the box, and the carriage was at once in swift motion. It crackled over the gravel, glided through the high, wide gate, curved smoothly to the right, and rolled away. The luxurious little space in which they sat was pervaded by a gentle warmth. "Shall I shut us in?" Sigmund asked. She nodded, and he drew the brown silk curtains across the polished panes. They were in the city's heart. Lights flew past behind the curtains. Their horses' hooves rhythmically beat the ground. The carriage swayed noiselessly over the uneven ground, and round them roared and shrieked and thundered the machinery of urban life. Quite safe and shut away, they sat among the quilted brown silk cushions, hand in hand. The carriage drew up and stopped. Wendelin was at the door to help them out. A little group of gray-faced, shivering people stood in the brilliance of the arc lights and followed them with hostile glances as they passed through the lobby. It was already late. They were the last. They mounted the staircase, threw their cloaks over Wendelin's arms, paused a second before a high mirror, then went through the little door into their box. They were greeted by the last sounds before the hush, voices and the slamming of seats. The lackey pushed their plush-upholstered chairs beneath them. At that moment, the lights went down, and below their box, the orchestra broke into the wild, pulsating notes of the prelude. Night and tempest, and they, who had been wafted hither on the wings of ease, with no petty annoyances on the way, were in exactly the right mood and could give all their attention at once. Storm, a raging tempest, the wailing of the winds in the woods. The angry god's command resounded, once, twice repeated in its wrath. Obediently the thunder crashed. The curtain flew up as though blown by the storm. There was the rude hall, dark save for a glow on the pagan hearth. In the center towered up the trunk of the ash tree. Sigmund appeared in the doorway and leaned against the wooden post, beaten and harried by the storm. Wearily he moved forwards on his sturdy legs wrapped round with hide and thongs. He was rosy-skinned, with a straw-colored beard. Beneath his blond brows and the blond forelock of his wig, his blue eyes were directed upon the conductor with an imploring gaze. At last the orchestra gave way to his voice, which rang clear and metallic, though he tried to make it sound like a gasp. He sang a few bars, to the effect that no matter to whom the hearth belonged, he must rest upon it, and at the last word he let himself drop heavily on the bearskin rug and lay there with his head cushioned on his plump arms. His breast heaved in slumber. A minute passed, filled with the singing, speaking flow of the music, rolling its waves at the feet of the events on the stage. Sieglind entered from the left. She had an alabaster bosom which heaved magnificently against the neckline of her fur-trimmed muslin dress. She displayed surprise at the sight of the stranger, pressed her chin upon her breast until furrows appeared round the lips as they formed the words giving expression to her surprise in tones which swelled, soft and warm, from her white throat and were given shape by her tongue and her mobile lips. She tended the stranger, bending over him so that her bosom strained towards him from the wilderness of fur like ripe buds. She proffered him the drinking horn with both hands. He drank. The music spoke movingly to him of cool refreshment and cherishing care. They looked at each other with the beginning of enchantment, a first dim recognition, silently abandoning themselves while the orchestra sang in a melody of profound enchantment. She gave him mead, first touching the horn with her lips, then watching while he took a long draught. Again their glances met and mingled, while below, the melody voiced their yearning. Then he rose, in deep dejection, turning away painfully, his arms hanging at his sides, to the door, that he might remove from her sight his affliction, his loneliness, his persecuted, hated existence, and bear it back into the wild. She called upon him, but he did not hear. Heedless of self, she lifted up her arms and confessed her intolerable anguish. He stopped. Her eyes fell. Below them, the music spoke darkly of the bond of suffering that united them. He stayed. He folded his arms and remained by the hearth, awaiting his destiny. Announced by his pugnacious motif, Hundig entered, paunchy and knock-kneed, like a cow. His beard was black with brown tufts. He stood there frowning, leaning heavily on his spear, and staring ox-eyed at the stranger guest. But as the primitive custom would have it, he bade him welcome in an enormous, rusty bass. Sieglind laid the evening meal. Hundig's slow, suspicious gaze moved to and fro between her and the stranger. Dull out though he was, he could well see that they resembled one another, were of one and the same breed, that odd, untrammeled, rebellious stock, which he hated, to which he felt inferior. They sat down, and Hundig, in a few words, introduced himself and accounted for his simple, regular, and orthodox existence. Thus he forced Sigmund to speak of himself, and that was incomparably more difficult. Yet Sigmund spoke. He sang clearly and with wonderful beauty of his life and misfortunes. He told how he had been born with a twin sister, and as people do who dare not speak out, he called himself by a false name. He gave a moving account of the hatred and envy which had been the bane of his life and his strange father's life, how their hall had been burnt, his sister carried off, how they had led in the forest a harried, persecuted, outlawed life, and how finally he had mysteriously lost his father as well. And then Sigmund sang the most painful thing of all. He told of his yearning for human beings, his longing and ceaseless loneliness. He sang of men and women, of friendship and love he had sometimes won, only to be thrust back again into the dark. A curse had lain upon him forever. He was marked by the brand of his strange origins. His speech had not been that of others, nor theirs his. What he found good was vexation to them. He was galled by the ancient laws to which they paid honor. Always and everywhere he had lived amid anger and strife. He had borne the yoke of scorn and hatred and contempt, all because he was strange, of a breed and kind hopelessly different from them. The way Hundig reacted to all this was entirely characteristic. His reply showed no sympathy and no understanding, but only a sour disgust and suspicion of all Sigmund's story. And finally understanding that the stranger standing here on his own hearth was the very outlaw he had, following a summons, been hunting that day. He behaved just as one would have expected of the brawny pedant he was. With a grim sort of courtesy, he declared that his house was sacred and would protect the fugitive for that night, but that on the morrow he would have the honor of slaying him in battle. Gruffly he commanded Sigmund to the inner chamber, to spice his night drink for him and to wait for him in bed. Then after a few more threats he followed her, taking all his weapons with him and leaving Sigmund alone and despairing by the hearth. Up in the box, Sigmund bent over the velvet ledge and leaned his dark boyish head on his narrow red hand. His brows made 2 black furrows, and one foot, resting on the heel of his patent leather shoe, was in constant nervous motion. But it stopped as he heard a whisper close to him, "Gigi." His mouth, as he turned, had an insolent twist. Sigmund was holding out to him a mother-of-pearl box with maraschino cherries. "The brandy chocolates are underneath," she whispered. But he accepted only a cherry, and as he took it out of the tissue paper wrapping, she said in his ear, "She will come back to him again at once." "I am not entirely unaware of the fact," he said, so loud that several heads were jerked angrily in his direction.